Wendy and Palmer had been living together for 20 years, and there seemed to be one of those unions destined for happiness. Despite the lack of children, which was a bitter drawback for Wendy, Palmer surrounded her with love and support, for which she was immensely grateful. Several years ago, when she was diagnosed with cancer, it was thanks to her husband, who spotted the problem in time and insisted on treatment, that Wendy was able to cope with the disease. The tumor was localized at an early stage, and since then her condition has stabilized. The disease was in remission. One day Wendy came home late in the evening as usual, and began sorting out her things in the hallway. Just at that time she needed to get ready for dinner faster. She accidentally touched Palmer's briefcase, which fell to the floor, and out of it slipped a small box, like the ones they sell jewelry in. Curiosity overpowered, and Wendy carefully opened the box. Inside was a dainty gold pendant, and she realized at once that it might have been a gift from her husband for their anniversary. Wendy was touched by the gesture, but she decided to keep the surprise a secret. Realizing that Palmer wanted to do her a favor, she carefully tucked the box back into the case and put it back in its place. Palmer always tried to please Wendy, even when they didn't have much money. Over the years, he had learnt to do it in a truly exquisite way. Memories of him giving her bouquets of flowers, pleasing her when she came home from work, filled her heart with warmth. Every evening when she came home, she would find a new bouquet, and that was one of the ways he showed his love. So, on the eve of their anniversary, Wendy decided to have a romantic dinner, cooking Palmer's favorite dish. She anticipated the evening and prepared for it with special trepidation. When Palmer came home, Wendy decided to express her love and appreciation. As if in response to her inner monologue, they sat down at the table. Wendy was filled with tender feelings and pride that she was able to share 20 whole years of her life with her husband. Palmer held out a box of jewelry to Wendy. At that moment, Wendy felt genuine surprise and joy as she discovered that it was not the same pendant she had seen before. The box was the same as the one she had found, but inside was a completely different piece of jewelry. It was a surprise she couldn't even guess at, and the joy of such an unexpected gift overflowed her heart. When Palmer handed Wendy the gift, he was delighted. He was proud that he had chosen what he thought was the perfect match for his wife's dresses, especially the green and black she loved so much. His joy was sparkling and he waited eagerly for Wendy's reaction, anticipating her pleasure. Wendy, with slight embarrassment, examined the jewelry. The pendant was truly magnificent and, by the looks of it, quite expensive. Palmer noticed her confusion and, sensing that something was wrong, became worried. He tried to find out what was wrong. He sounded worried when he asked if everything was all right, because just then Wendy had looked cheerful and now her mood had changed. Unable to bear it, Wendy decided to reveal her thoughts to her husband. She told him that she had accidentally discovered the other pendant the day before when it had fallen out of the case. Wendy admitted that she was surprised and even a little puzzled, because the pendant she had seen earlier was completely different, although it was also beautiful and probably expensive. She wondered who the pendant she had discovered had been bought for. Palmer listened to her, a little surprised but understanding. He explained that the pendant she had found was actually a gift for a co-worker who was having a birthday party. Palmer clarified that he had decided to make it a gift from the staff, and he had accidentally bought the jewelry at the same store that he had bought it for Wendy. Wendy was relieved to hear the explanation. She appreciated that Palmer had not disappointed her, and that the gift had indeed been for her. She assured her husband that she felt no jealousy and was proud of him for his generosity and kindness. The reassurance that Palmer was not involved in any misunderstanding only strengthened their relationship. Palmer was glad that Wendy accepted Wendy's explanation and appreciated her words of gratitude. He hugged her, and they both felt that the misunderstanding had been cleared up. Happy relief overflowed them, and they continued the evening in a relaxed and joyful atmosphere. As Wendy and Palmer sat down to dinner, Palmer informed Wendy of his plans for the next day. He said that he would be late at work because he had to be involved in organizing a birthday party for a coworker for whom he was buying a pendant that Wendy had discovered. Wendy, for her part, was also going to work the second shift, but planned to come home a little earlier than her husband. Palmer remembered another important detail. He told Wendy about a request from a colleague who had asked to consult his acquaintance about gynecology, since Wendy worked as a gynecologist. Palmer was pleased that Wendy would be able to help with this. Wendy gratefully accepted the message and promised to do what she could. Her relief was obvious when she learned that the pendant issue had been resolved and that she could finally rest easy. The next day, Wendy arrived at work and noticed a young woman waiting for her. She introduced herself as Megan and confirmed that she had called earlier about the consultation Palmer had requested. Wendy, with a friendly nod, motioned for them to go into the office for a checkup. Once they were in, Wendy suggested that Megan talk about her concerns. Megan, slightly embarrassed, admitted that she didn't need an exam, but wanted counseling about abortion. She wasn't sure what it would take or how much it would cost. Wendy asked why Megan had decided to have an abortion and what her motives were. Megan responded by expressing her dissatisfaction with a future that she felt did not include a child. Wendy listened carefully and pointed out that Megan was only 18 years old, and her decision might have something to do with the fact that she didn't think she was ready for motherhood yet. Wendy cautioned that it was best to think twice about this decision. She cited an example from her practice where many women who had already had an abortion regretted their choice and had difficulty deciding to have a child afterward. In response, Megan asked why she was being told about it. Wendy explained that her purpose was to give her an opportunity to think about the consequences. As a woman, she could understand the desire to avoid complexity, but as a doctor, she felt the need to warn of possible future difficulties. Megan, a little confused, mentioned that her boyfriend, Scott, wasn't ready to have kids yet. However, Wendy remarked that it was probably Scott's opinion and shouldn't be taken as a final decision. Megan explained that her friend had recently gotten pregnant, and her boyfriend was eventually forced to marry her. Megan also mentioned that Scott had condemned her friend's act, calling it mean and stupid, and it had influenced her decision. Wendy advised Megan to talk to Scott, expressing her point of view. She emphasized that if Scott truly loved her, the baby would be welcome to him, and perhaps he would change his mind. Wendy assured Megan that if she decided to continue talking to Scott, have him be sure to let her know the outcome. She also reminded her that she could always call her if she had any questions. Megan, somewhat relieved, thanked Wendy and said goodbye. Wendy wished her good luck and a good day, and they parted ways. After work, Wendy decided to take a little walk in the company of her friend and co-worker Samantha, whom she had always trusted. On the way, she shared her recent story with her. Wendy confessed that for the first time in 20 years she was beginning to doubt her husband's fidelity. Her voice was full of embarrassment and shame as she felt she had wrongly suspected Palmer. Samantha listened to Wendy and expressed her opinion. She thought that Wendy's doubts were well-founded, especially considering how strange everything had turned out: the anniversary, the banquet, and the jewelry. Samantha acknowledged that her explanations about what had happened might seem suspicious. She added that intuition can often be the right signal, and that it might be worth paying attention to her feelings. Wendy, feeling her excitement rising again, asked Samantha to stop discussing it and not to confuse her further. She was ready to dismiss any negative thoughts and didn't even want to consider the possibility that Palmer might have someone else. Wendy only wanted to calm down and believe in the best. Samantha, not wanting to leave her friend in a state of uncertainty, suggested checking to see if Palmer was really at the banquet. She suggested calling his work number and finding out where he was. Wendy, having already almost forgotten her doubts, decided to follow this advice. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed her husband's work number. When Wendy called work, she was told that Palmer was no longer in the office. He had to leave earlier than usual. Wendy asked about the banquet he was supposedly going to and was told that the event was in a few days. This news only added to the confusion in her feelings, and she hung up the phone, feeling her anxiety unabated. Wendy and Samantha continued their conversation, and Wendy couldn't hide her confusion. She reminded her friend that in their 20 years together, Palmer had never once given her cause for jealousy. Wendy couldn't believe that her marital happiness was now in doubt. She felt that the whole situation seemed ridiculous and implausible. Samantha, it seemed, was not so sure. She made her point that men often cheat, and perhaps she should reconsider her ideas about fidelity. Samantha reminded Wendy that one couldn't always rely on idealized images, and that more complex and unpleasant truths could lurk under the pretense of fidelity. Despite all this reasoning, Wendy couldn't understand how her life, filled with love and trust, could become so vulnerable. Samantha, being rather cynical about personal relationships because of her own failures in marriage, might not have understood the subtleties of Wendy's feelings. She had always believed that pride was more important than blind love, and reminded her friend to take care of her own dignity. Wendy, regretting that her trust might be violated, tried to understand why things had gone wrong. She questioned other possible reasons for Palmer's behavior other than infidelity and wondered where he might have been today. Samantha, for her part, tried to comfort Wendy by suggesting that Palmer could have simply gotten the date mixed up or was busy with work-related concerns. Samantha suggested another course of action to Wendy. Instead of making assumptions and having doubts, it would be better to ask Palmer directly about his activities and verify the truth of his explanations. Samantha felt that a direct conversation could clarify the situation and avoid further misunderstandings. Wendy, though feeling trapped by her own emotions, realized that an honest conversation might be the only way out of the situation. She was willing to consider this advice, hoping that honesty would help her understand the true reasons for what was happening. Wendy, having made the decision to deal with the situation, felt her spirits lighten. She decided that she shouldn't speculate and fantasize. It was better to talk to Palmer directly. This thought immediately brought her relief, and she was ready for an open conversation. That evening Palmer came home very late. Wendy, gathering her courage, decided to find out where he had been, but without being hysterical. She simply asked him about it, not hiding her concern. Palmer, surprised by such a question, wondered why he should make excuses. He assured her that there had been no affair and called the conversation silly. Palmer explained that it was all about soccer. He said that he and his friends had decided to get together to watch their team's qualifying match against Luxembourg, to drink beer and support their team. It had been planned for a long time, and Palmer, thinking it a simple pastime, hadn't seen fit to announce it right away. Wendy, though not a soccer fan, accepted the explanation, realizing that Palmer was really just spending the evening with friends. She forgave him for the misunderstanding, realizing that there was really no reason for a serious conflict. Wendy wasn't jealous, although she didn't like Palmer's company. She decided it was better to discuss things directly than to cause a scandal. The next day, to smooth over the remnants of yesterday's misunderstanding, Wendy prepared a homemade lunch and decided to take it to Palmer's office. When she arrived at work, she noticed that his car was already in place. However, at that moment, her attention was caught by a young girl getting into Palmer's car. Wendy felt her anxiety returning, and doubt resurfaced in her thoughts. Wendy, feeling a wave of anxiety, decided to find out immediately what was going on. She dialed Palmer's phone number, hoping to get clarification from him. But her attempt was cut short when Palmer, answering in an official tone, informed her that he was in a meeting and very busy. Wendy realized that once again she was faced with the fact that she seemed destined to become one of those women who were cheated on by their husbands. On her way to work, Wendy met Samantha and shared her suspicions with her. Samantha suggested following Palmer to find out the truth. Wendy was skeptical at first, but Samantha insisted that she take a few days off to follow her husband. Samantha even suggested that Wendy could tell Palmer that she'd been sent on a business trip and devote her own time to watching him. Wendy hesitated, but soon realized that it was the only way to find out if Palmer was faithful to her. At work, Wendy ran into Megan, a girl she had recently counseled. Megan, looking pleased, thanked her for her help. She revealed that she had talked to her young man, and he had been happy with her decision. Megan explained that her boyfriend, Scott, had assured her that their relationship was different from those of other couples and that everything would be fine. At that moment, Wendy noticed a familiar pendant around Megan's neck. Wendy's desire to learn more about the jewelry was interrupted when Megan's cell phone rang. The girl apologized that she had to leave and quickly said goodbye. Wendy was left alone with her thoughts, hoping she could make sense of the situation and find an answer to her questions. Wendy, exhausted by doubts and worries, sank deeper and deeper into despair. Her mind was racing with thoughts of looking for excuses and clinging to the last strings. Samantha, her friend, tried to assuage her fears, noting that everyone in such situations tends to seek comfort and make up explanations. She tried to remind Wendy that Palmer's co-workers might also have been involved in discussions about how they had given a birthday pendant, which could then be passed on. But Wendy, tired with uncertainty, just couldn't believe this explanation. She was utterly distraught, tormented by the feeling that her world was crumbling. Samantha tried to comfort her, saying that she shouldn't be so worried, that Palmer might have really given in to temptation. She said she should be angry instead of crying, even though Wendy didn't understand why Palmer was acting as if nothing had happened, giving her presents and carrying on as if nothing had happened. Wendy felt that her exhausted state had reached its limit. All this time she had been trying to hold on, but now she was getting worse. The dizziness was increasing, and she felt as if she were about to faint. Everything around her seemed unreal, like a dream. Not long ago she had been a happy person, and now, suddenly, her world had crumbled. She knew that following Palmer was a decision she had to make to find out the truth. Everything going on around her seemed painful and confusing, and Wendy realized that the only way to diffuse her emotions was to go straight to Palmer and find out what was going on. Noticing that Wendy's condition had worsened, Samantha insisted on walking her home. She was concerned and advised Wendy to get tested. Samantha emphasized that, despite their medical training, one shouldn't hide one's head in the sand, especially since Wendy had already beaten cancer a few years earlier. Samantha reminded them to get checked regularly to avoid potential problems. Wendy, although she wasn't feeling well, agreed that regular checkups were necessary. She promised to go to the lab tomorrow and get tested. Samantha offered to pick up the results herself so that Palmer wouldn't suspect anything, since Wendy planned to be away on a business trip. Late that night, over dinner, Wendy began to put her plan into action, trying to remain calm. She started a conversation about a supposedly upcoming business trip. Wendy explained to Palmer that she would need to go to a conference the next day. She tried to be casual and added that no special preparation was required, since the main purpose was simply to attend from the clinic. Palmer, concerned, offered to walk her, but Wendy declined, explaining that she could manage on her own, since she didn't have much stuff. The next day, Wendy met Samantha at work. Samantha, noticing her friend's exhausted look, couldn't resist expressing her thoughts directly. She advised Wendy to seriously consider divorce, because, in her opinion, if a person does not love you and lives with you out of pity, then life in such a marriage has no meaning. Wendy was astonished by this advice, for she did not think she deserved pity. But Samantha continued, explaining that she and Palmer, and her primary care physician, had kept the truth about the progression of the disease from Wendy. She admitted that Palmer had probably believed in the placebo effect, hoping that Wendy would believe in her recovery. Regardless, the latest tests turned out to be bad, and Wendy, who hadn't felt her health deteriorate until now, was shocked by the news. Her world crumbled when she learned that her husband knew about the growing disease and that he would soon have a new family. Wendy was terribly sorry that she had learned the truth, believing that it would have been better to remain in ignorance. Wendy said goodbye to Samantha and walked away feeling in a daze. Suddenly, an unfamiliar young man called out to her on the street. He explained that the hospital staff had informed him that Wendy had just gotten out. The young man, who introduced himself as Scott, thanked Wendy for talking his girlfriend out of having an abortion. He was truly grateful and was glad that her advice had helped. Wendy was confused, not realizing how her intervention could have affected this man. Scott explained that his girlfriend, Megan, was the very person that Wendy had talked Wendy out of having an abortion a few days earlier. Scott was so relieved that he expressed his gratitude to Wendy for her help. Wendy felt her tension ease a little, but still, the news and situation left her distraught. She immediately decided to share this unexpected discovery with Samantha. Wendy spent a long time trying to make sense of the situation, and everything she learned only confirmed her worst fears. Samantha nodded as she listened to her friend confirm that Megan was seeing both Palmer and Scott. The news came at a good time, as Samantha was about to tell Wendy about her hunch, but didn't have time. Feeling cheated and betrayed, Wendy immediately decided that she needed to tell Palmer the truth. Samantha tried to talk her out of it, arguing that there was no point in it. In her opinion, Palmer had already received his punishment, but Wendy was adamant. Her own torment was all too familiar to her, and she didn't want Palmer to experience the same. She was determined to find out the details and headed to Palmer's office to talk to him. But there was a new obstacle in her way. Her cell phone suddenly rang, and the number of the department head popped up on the screen. It was an urgent call reporting an incident at work. Accountable drugs were missing, and Wendy had to deal with the situation. Having cleared up the confusion, Wendy headed for the hospital exit when the supervisor caught up with her. "Wendy, you forgot your bag," he said, holding out her bag to her. Wendy, consumed with thoughts of her upcoming conversation with Palmer, thanked the supervisor and without waiting for a response, headed for the exit and saw Palmer there. Wendy was ready to reveal all her suspicions. However, Palmer, seeing the hospital superintendent handing Wendy the bag, immediately began accusing her of cheating. "What are you doing here?" he asked, looking at Wendy in surprise. "You were supposed to be at a conference," he continued, even more puzzled by her presence. Wendy, feeling her emotions boiling over, couldn't stand it and shrieked. "You've been lying to me for a long time, cheating on me for a long time." Palmer, perplexed and indignant, replied, "What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? I don't know what you're talking about at all." A stormy quarrel ensued between them. Wendy, who had not expected such a turn of events, realized that Palmer was accusing her of cheating on him. Everything had been turned upside down, and now she was having trouble figuring out who was right and who was wrong. Palmer's words sounded like deceit, but Wendy's feelings were filled with deep resentment and mistrust. Palmer, full of anger, could not conceal his indignation. He stared at Wendy in bewilderment, unable to believe that she could say such words. Palmer didn't understand how she could allow herself to do such a thing, and asked reproachfully if she even realized what she was saying. His voice was full of indignation and reproach, as if he could not forgive her for daring to speak like that. Wendy, standing in front of him, felt as if her body had run out of strength all at once. She felt dizzy, her eyes blurred, and she thought she was about to fall. The whole situation seemed so terrible that she felt her world crumbling. Soon Wendy was immediately hospitalized, and the doctors began her examination. When she recovered a little, Palmer was allowed to enter the room. He stood by her bedside with mixed feelings ranging from upset to regret. The realization that his own actions could have had such an effect on Wendy began to seep through his anger. Palmer, already calmer, apologized for his abruptness. He realized that perhaps in his anger he had forgotten about her own worries and was worried about her health. The doctor's staff had told him that Wendy was not yet fully recovered and he had to be patient. Palmer, standing by Wendy's bedside, finally managed to pull himself together and, seeing her agony, expressed his regret. His voice, now softer and more apologetic, sounded sincere. He admitted that in his anger he had forgotten her own worries and was only worried about himself. Palmer, still embarrassed, began to talk about what was bothering him. He couldn't understand why she could think he was having an affair with another man. Wendy tried to explain that her words were nothing more than the aftermath of the unrest that was plaguing her. "What, you think I have someone else?" Palmer couldn't believe that Wendy could think that. Wendy noticed that Palmer was really upset and didn't understand what was going on. Palmer told her that he had received an anonymous message saying that she wasn't at a conference right now, but was here with the superintendent. That message had prompted him to take an action that he now regretted. Wendy tried to explain that she wasn't at the conference as planned, but that didn't mean she was cheating on him. "Why did you have to make it all up?" Palmer couldn't understand Wendy's motivation. She admitted that her intentions were not at all what he might have thought, and that she just wanted to deal with the situation. Palmer, when confronted with her explanation, still couldn't fully believe her words, but something in his heart began to change. He realized that his actions of mistrust and an anonymous message could have been wrong. Wendy and Palmer remained in a difficult situation, trying to find a path to understanding and forgiveness. Wendy, pulling herself together, decided to reveal to Palmer all the truth she had been able to discover over the past few days. She detailed her suspicions, how her worries and observations had led her to believe that Palmer was cheating on her with Megan. There was tension in her voice as she informed Palmer that Megan, it turned out, was not the only woman in his life. Palmer seemed deeply shocked by this admission. His reaction was far from expected. He didn't look angry or defensive. Instead, his face reddened with embarrassment and his voice became shaky as he began apologizing to Wendy for not telling her the whole truth sooner. "Megan is not my mistress," Palmer admitted. "She's my daughter." Wendy was shocked. She couldn't even believe her ears. She had expected to hear anything but this, that Megan was his mistress, that they had a long-standing relationship, or that Palmer was going to leave her. But what he was saying seemed completely insane to her. Palmer continued to explain that Megan was his daughter, born when he and Wendy were already married. He recalled that he had cheated on Wendy once, years ago, while intoxicated. It had happened 20 years ago, and he himself had been horrified at what he had done. He repented for the act, which was now made even more painful when it was discovered that he had a daughter. Palmer revealed that he had only recently learned of Megan's existence. Megan's mother had left a diary when she died, which included information about the girl's real father. Palmer and Megan had a DNA test, which confirmed his paternity. These revelations shocked Wendy. She had mixed feelings: shock, disbelief, and bitterness. Palmer was sincere in his words, but their unexpected truth only aggravated her inner feelings. After everything came to light, Wendy thought back and analyzed Palmer's behavior for a long time, trying to understand if there were any signs pointing to his secret actions. But Palmer had always behaved naturally, skillfully hiding his emotions and thoughts. Wendy remembered how they had never hidden the truth from each other, and her inner conflict grew at the realization that Palmer could have deceived her for so long. Palmer, admitting his mistakes, explained that his fear of losing Wendy had been so great that he would have preferred to lie to keep her. He admitted that he had planned to tell her the truth, but had always put that moment off in search of the right time. The story with Megan and Scott had only made things more complicated. Palmer explained that Scott was actually her boyfriend, and she hadn't told him or Palmer anything about her decision to have an abortion. Megan simply asked to find her a good gynecologist, and Palmer, not knowing how to do otherwise, referred her to Wendy. Palmer genuinely admired how Wendy had talked Megan into keeping the baby. He revealed that Megan's life had gotten better. Scott had proposed to her, and they had just returned from his parents, who had approved of their choice. Now they'd applied for the registry office. Palmer was happy for Megan and her future husband. He admitted that after seeing the meeting with Megan, Wendy had probably realized how hard it had been for him to hide it all. He felt like everything came at him all at once and the pain of cheating was unbearable. Palmer also admitted that he had known about Wendy's illness from the beginning. Samantha appeared to have told him about her condition. Palmer wondered why Wendy hadn't noticed that he'd known about her relapse. He regretfully said that he'd made a lot of mistakes, and now that things were cleared up, he felt deep remorse. He apologized, assuring her that he would always be there for her and would never betray her. Wendy, seeing Palmer's sincerity and suffering, felt the weight on her heart lighten a little. She knew that forgiveness could be difficult, but realizing that Palmer was genuinely remorseful helped her cope with her emotions. Despite everything that had happened, Wendy knew that her illness would inevitably separate them, and that added to the bitterness in her soul. The next morning, the head of the hospital walked into Wendy's room. His face was serious, but with a faint smile. He began with a question that seemed unexpected and made Wendy a little wary. The doctor asked where Wendy got the idea of a relapse. She clarified that it all started with the test, which she said showed a worsening. Wendy, still confused and worried about recent events, mentioned that she felt sick and even fainted. To this, the superintendent replied that he had two pieces of news, one good and one even better, and suggested that Wendy choose which one to start with. First, he reported that there was no relapse. The superintendent's words brought Wendy relief. Her illness had not returned and her health was fine. This news was like a balm to her soul, but then came the next revelation, which surprised her even more. The doctor reported that her ailments were pregnancy-related. This was a surprise to Wendy. She never thought she could get pregnant, especially given her condition. Wendy's mind was racing as she realized that she really could be pregnant. Panic and bewilderment were replaced by the realization that Samantha, as a doctor, should have noticed and known about it sooner. Wendy couldn't understand how Samantha could have been wrong in her assumptions and diagnoses. Confusion and doubt overwhelmed her, as she had almost reconciled herself to the idea of the imminent end. Now that she knew she was pregnant, she felt her world had been turned upside down again, and she was at a loss for words. That same day, Wendy decided it was time to have a serious talk with Samantha. She summoned her and, without hiding her excitement, demanded that she explain what was going on. The situation was too confusing, and Wendy couldn't believe that Samantha could have been unaware of what was going on. She insisted on an explanation, and Samantha soon confirmed Wendy's darkest suspicions. Samantha, not hiding her cold determination, admitted that all of these events, the medication theft, the paperwork mix-up, even the anonymous messages to Palmer, had been part of her plan. She had deliberately arranged all this trouble so that Palmer would see Wendy with the head of the hospital. Wendy was overwhelmed. Her mind was a storm of emotions, and she could hardly believe Samantha's words. Samantha went on to say that it was all done with intent. She mentioned that all of her actions were directed at Wendy as a way to get revenge for her divorce and for ruining her life. After all, Samantha herself had once gotten pregnant as a result of her husband's infidelity and had an abortion, and Wendy said that it was her husband who forced her to get rid of the child. Samantha's husband, though, did not suspect either the infidelity or Samantha's pregnancy. As a result, Samantha was no longer able to have children. Samantha's husband often complained about this to Wendy, and Wendy, in response, rebuked him that it was his fault, since he should not have forced Samantha to have an abortion. That's how the whole truth about Samantha's infidelity and her abortion came out. Wendy, unable to bear it, asked Samantha why she had done all this and why she had decided to act in such a way. Samantha, not hiding her anger, stated that her revenge was not only for the divorce, but for the many other wrongs that had accumulated over the years. She blamed Wendy for saying bad things about her to her husband that had caused her to act with such premeditation. Samantha felt that Wendy didn't deserve forgiveness and couldn't even understand how she could be wrong to think that everything that had happened was an accident. Wendy had a hard time taking it all in. It was hard for her to believe that Samantha, with whom she had once shared common problems and a common understanding, now blamed her for all her troubles. She remembered that Samantha had been in a similar situation herself, unable to have children and, in her own words, had built her entire life on deceit. Samantha blamed Wendy for allegedly ruining her life, even though Samantha was in the same situation but had made her own choices. Wendy looked at her and couldn't understand how such hatred and anger could arise. Her emotions overwhelmed her, and she realized that it was all far from the truth she wanted to hear. Eventually, Wendy learned that her own suspicions and fears were justified, and in that painful revelation she lost the last vestige of calm. Samantha continued to accuse her, and Wendy felt her heart breaking at the injustice and betrayal. Samantha continued, not hiding her rage. She clearly couldn't help the words that were boiling in her soul. She said she didn't know what to do, and it was all because of Wendy. She blamed her for Wendy ruining her life, leaving no room for normalcy. Samantha called Wendy a chicken, who had put her in such a difficult situation. Samantha recalled how her husband had found out about her cheating. He left, leaving her with no support and no child, and Samantha found herself with a damn job and Wendy, who she felt had been around forever and only added to her misery. Samantha was filled with hatred and continued to blame Wendy for all her troubles. She especially resented the fact that Wendy, against all her expectations, had somehow miraculously gotten pregnant and was now preparing to become a mother. Samantha could not contain her emotions and expressed her deep satisfaction that Wendy was suffering. For Samantha, the past few days had been the happiest of her life. Seeing Wendy crying and sobbing, Samantha felt a bittersweet pleasure. Flowers bloomed in her soul, as she ironically put it, from the realization that her plan had worked. Samantha assured Wendy that she never wanted to see her again. She considered herself betrayed, especially since it had been Wendy, as a friend, who had betrayed her trust. Wendy recalled how she had always treated people with kindness and expected the same treatment in return. All this time, she had thought Samantha was her friend and had followed her advice, but as it turned out, she had been deceived. Samantha gave Wendy no chance to justify herself. Her words were full of venom and contempt. A year passed and Wendy finally cut off all communication with Samantha. The relationship between Wendy and Palmer mended, and they were happy again. Megan married Scott, who turned out to be a very talented and promising computer programmer. Palmer even took his son-in-law to work, where he quickly established himself as a valuable employee. Wendy and Megan became mothers almost simultaneously. It was unusual and joyous at the same time. At the park, when they would start running and talking, those around them would be jealous. Seeing a father and grandfather proud of his child and grandchild seemed like a true miracle. Palmer reflected on his life, remembering how a youthful sin had almost cost him his family. He was grateful that Wendy had been able to forgive him, but he couldn't forgive himself for the pain he had caused her. Now he had 2 children, and though he had almost stopped believing it was possible, life had surprised him. The mistakes they had made had been righted. Palmer realized that you only begin to appreciate what you have when you lose it. Wendy, despite losing her friend, had gained the happiness she had never dreamed of, a large and friendly family. Everything in their lives was finally back to normal, and they felt that truth and forgiveness could be found even when all seemed lost.